When Michael Jordan stood alone in an empty gym at 3 in the morning with tears running down his face, it wasn't because he lost a game. It was because the person he trusted most in the world had just stolen $7 million from him. But what Michael did next didn't just show he was the greatest basketball player ever. It showed he was the greatest person. This is the story of how Tino Allen Whitmore, Michael's best friend since they were 15 years old, betrayed him in the worst way possible, and how Michael's response proved why he'll always be the GOAT. Tino had grown up 3 houses down from Michael in Willington, North Carolina. Back when being cut from the varsity basketball team as a sophomore felt like the end of the world rather than the beginning of a legend. The basketball slammed against the hardwood with a sound that echoed through the empty Chicago stadium like a gunshot. And Michael Jordan stood at the free throw line with tears streaming down his face that had nothing to do with the game he loved more than breathing itself. It was 3 in the morning on a Tuesday in March of 1993. And the man who had conquered every opponent, silenced every critic, and elevated himself to heights that seemed to defy the laws of both physics and human achievement, found himself facing a betrayal so profound that it threatened to shatter everything he had built. The person who had done this to him wasn't some rival trying to knock him off his throne, wasn't some jealous teammate resentful of his success, and wasn't some opportunistic stranger looking to profit from his fame. It was Tino Allen Whitmore, the one human being on this earth that Michael had trusted with the deepest parts of himself, the person who had been there before the championships, before the endorsements, before the world knew the name Jordan meant something more than just a country in the Middle East. Tino had grown up 3 houses down from Michael in Wilmington, North Carolina, back when being cut from the varsity basketball team as a sophomore felt like the end of the world rather than the beginning of a legend. While other kids had mocked Michael for that failure, Tino had been the one who showed up at 6 in the morning to rebound for him, who listened to him rage against the injustice of it all, who promised him that greatness was coming even when the evidence suggested otherwise. They had made a pact, sitting on Tino's front porch that humid summer evening in 1979, 2 15-year-old boys who swore on everything they held sacred that no matter what happened, no matter where life took them, they would always have each other's backs against a world that seemed designed to break young black men who dared to dream beyond their circumstances. Michael had kept that promise through everything that followed. When he exploded onto the scene at the University of North Carolina, when he hit the shot that won the national championship as a freshman, when the offers and the attention started flooding in from every direction, he had made sure Tino was right there with him, not as an employee, not as a hanger-on, but as a brother who deserved to share in the success that they had both sacrificed for during those early morning practice sessions, when the rest of the world was still sleeping. Michael had set Tino up with a position in his growing business empire, had trusted him with financial decisions that involved millions of dollars, had given him access to information and opportunities that people would have killed for, and had done it all without a second thought, because that's what you did for the person who had believed in you when you were nothing. The betrayal had started small, so small that Michael had missed it at first, despite the obsessive attention to detail that made him great on the basketball court. It began with discrepancies in accounts that Tino managed, numbers that didn't quite add up but were always explained away with reasonable-sounding excuses about timing and transfers and the complexity of managing multiple revenue streams. Michael had accepted these explanations because doubting Tino felt like doubting himself, like questioning the very foundation upon which he had built, not just his business empire, but his entire understanding of loyalty and friendship. The warning signs had been there for anyone paying attention: whispered conversations that stopped when Michael entered rooms, documents that Tino seemed reluctant to share, phone calls taken in hushed tones that ended abruptly when someone else approached. But Michael had been so consumed with chasing his 3rd consecutive championship that he had let these red flags pass by unchallenged. The truth had revealed itself in the most devastating way possible, not through some dramatic confrontation or smoking gun evidence, but through a series of cascading revelations that had built like a slow-motion car crash that Michael could see coming, but felt powerless to stop. It started when Jennifer Lawson, Michael's accountant who had been brought in to prepare for tax season, had noticed irregularities that couldn't be explained away by timing or complexity. She had spent 3 sleepless weeks following the money trail, documenting transfers that made no business sense, uncovering shell companies that existed only on paper, and piecing together a scheme that was so audacious in its scope that she had initially refused to believe what her own research was telling her. When she finally filed her findings to Michael late on a Friday evening in his office, overlooking Lake Michigan, spreading out the documents across his desk like a prosecutor presenting evidence at trial, he had initially dismissed her concerns with the same confidence that had carried him through countless fourth quarters when the game was on the line. But Jennifer had been thorough in a way that made denial impossible, and as she walked him through transaction after transaction, showing him how money had been systematically siphoned from accounts he controlled into ventures that benefited Tino exclusively, Michael had felt something break inside him that had nothing to do with physical injury. This wasn't a torn ligament that would heal with time and rehabilitation, wasn't a sprained ankle that would respond to ice and rest. This was the collapse of a fundamental truth that had organized his entire adult life, the revelation that the person he had trusted most in the world had been stealing from him for nearly 2 years, using that trust as a weapon to systematically drain resources that represented not just money, but the blood and sweat and sacrifice of thousands of hours spent perfecting a craft. The amount Tino had taken was staggering, somewhere north of $7 million when everything was tallied up, but the number itself was almost irrelevant to Michael because he had more money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes. What shattered him was the betrayal of everything their friendship had supposedly represented, the perversion of a bond that had been forged in loyalty and mutual sacrifice into something transactional and predatory. Tino had looked at their friendship and seen not a sacred obligation, but an opportunity to be exploited, had calculated that Michael's trust made him vulnerable rather than feeling honored by it, and had methodically constructed a scheme that turned Michael's greatest strength, his capacity for absolute loyalty to the people in his inner circle, into his most exploitable weakness. The confrontation had happened on a Monday morning in Tino's office, and Michael had gone there alone despite Jennifer's protests that he should bring lawyers and witnesses and people who could document what was said. He had needed to hear it directly from Tino's mouth, needed to understand how someone he loved like a brother could have done this, needed to give him the chance to explain even though the evidence was ironclad and undeniable. Tino had been sitting behind his desk looking at financial reports when Michael walked in, and for a moment everything had seemed normal, like countless other mornings when they had met to discuss business matters over coffee before Michael headed to practice. But then Michael had placed the folder of evidence on the desk between them, had watched the color drain from Tino's face as he recognized what those documents meant, and had asked the only question that mattered in that moment, the question that carried within it the weight of 15 years of friendship and trust. Why? Tino had tried to lie at first, had attempted to explain away the unexplainable with the same smooth talking that had kept the scheme hidden for so long, but Michael had cut through the excuses with a look that had intimidated opponents across the league for years. Not the competitive fire that showed up in games, but something colder and more terrible, the gaze of someone who had just watched their entire understanding of human nature get rewritten in real time. When the lies collapsed under the weight of documented evidence, Tino had finally told the truth, and that truth had been somehow worse than any fiction Michael could have imagined. Tino had felt diminished, living in Michael's shadow, had resented being known primarily as Michael Jordan's friend rather than as his own man, had convinced himself that he deserved this money as compensation for having his own identity subsumed into Michael's overwhelming fame, and had rationalized the theft as taking what should have rightfully been his anyway. Michael had listened to this explanation in silence, watching this person he had loved transform before his eyes into someone he didn't recognize, someone whose resentment and jealousy had curdled into something poisonous that had been eating away at their friendship from the inside, while Michael remained blissfully unaware. The grief he felt in that moment was more profound than any he had experienced before, because it was the death of something that couldn't be buried or mourned in any conventional way. Tino was still alive, still sitting across from him, still breathing the same air, but the person Michael had believed him to be had never actually existed. That Tino had been a fiction, a character Michael had created in his own mind by projecting his own values and integrity onto someone who didn't share them, and now he had to grapple with the reality that he had been wrong about someone so fundamental to his life for so long. The conversation had ended without violence or dramatic pronouncements, just Michael standing up and walking out of that office, knowing he would never speak to Tino Whitmore again, that whatever legal proceedings needed to happen would be handled by attorneys, and that the friendship they had shared was as dead as if one of them had actually died. But the pain of that ending followed him like a shadow, infecting his relationships with everyone else around him, because if he could be so catastrophically wrong about Marcus, how could he trust his judgment about anyone? The paranoia crept in during quiet moments, whispering that maybe everyone around him was just waiting for their chance to exploit his trust. That loyalty was nothing but a fairy tale people told themselves to avoid facing the ugly reality that everyone had a price, and everyone could be bought if the numbers got high enough. The impact showed up on the basketball court in ways that confused everyone who watched him play. Michael had always been known for his trust in teammates during crucial moments, his ability to make passes that required absolute faith that the other player would be in the right position at the right time. But now he found himself hesitating in situations where hesitation had never existed before. He would drive toward the basket and see teammates cutting to positions where they should receive the ball, but something would hold him back, some voice in his head, questioning whether they really wanted him to succeed or whether they were secretly rooting for him to fail so they could feel better about themselves. His scoring average actually went up that season because he took more shots himself rather than trusting others. But the basketball felt different in his hands, heavier somehow, like he was carrying not just the weight of winning, but the burden of being unable to trust anyone to help him bear that weight. Phil Jackson had noticed the change immediately because he had spent years studying Michael's psychology, learning to read his moods and motivations with the precision of a psychologist, analyzing a long-term patient. He pulled Michael aside after a game against the Knicks, where Michael had scored 47 points in a victory that had somehow felt hollow, where individual brilliance had compensated for a breakdown in the team dynamic that usually made the Bulls greater than the sum of their parts. They sat in Jackson's office long after everyone else had left the arena, and Phil had asked Michael what was really going on. Not as a coach concerned about winning, but as one human being genuinely worried about another. Michael had tried to deflect at first, had fallen back on the competitive persona that he showed the world, the myth of Michael Jordan as an unfeeling basketball machine who cared only about winning and dominance and putting up numbers that would cement his legacy. But Phil had pushed, had refused to accept the performance, had created space for Michael to be vulnerable in a way that felt terrifying after everything that had happened with Marcus. And finally, there in that quiet office with championship banners hanging overhead as silent witnesses, Michael had broken down and told him everything. Not just about the betrayal and the money, but about what it meant to discover that someone he had loved had never really loved him back, that their entire friendship had been contaminated by resentment and jealousy that Tino had hidden behind a smile while systematically stealing from him. He talked about how it made him question every relationship in his life, how it made him wonder whether his parents loved him for who he was or for what he could provide them, whether his teammates respected him or just tolerated him because he helped them win championships, whether anyone in his life valued him as a human being rather than as a resource to be exploited. Phil had listened without judgment or platitudes, had let Michael purge all the pain and confusion and rage that had been building up inside him like pressure in a volcano waiting to erupt. And when Michael finally fell silent, exhausted from the emotional exertion of exposing wounds he had kept hidden from everyone, Phil had shared something from his own life that Michael had never heard before. He talked about his own experience with betrayal during his playing days, about a teammate he had considered a close friend who had slept with Phil's girlfriend while Phil was on the road, and about how that betrayal had nearly destroyed not just his ability to trust other people, but his ability to trust his own judgment about human nature. He described the years he had spent walled off from genuine connection, protected by cynicism and emotional distance, and how that protection had kept him safe, but had also kept him alone in ways that made life feel empty, even when everything looked successful from the outside. But then Phil had said something that cut through Michael's despair like light breaking through clouds, something so simple and profound that it would fundamentally reshape how Michael understood both the betrayal and himself. He said that being betrayed by someone you trust doesn't make you foolish for trusting them. It makes them unworthy of the gift you gave them. That trust is not weakness, but strength. That the capacity to believe in people and give them opportunities to either honor or violate that belief is what separates people who can build something meaningful from people who can only protect what they already have. And most importantly, that letting Tino's betrayal destroy his ability to trust other people would mean letting Tino win twice, first by stealing his money, and second by stealing his capacity for connection, and that the truly unforgivable thing would be to let someone as small as Tino had revealed himself to be have that much power over who Michael would become. Michael had left that conversation feeling something shift inside him. Not a complete healing, because wounds that deep don't close overnight, but a fundamental reorientation of how he was processing what had happened. Instead of seeing the betrayal as evidence that trust was foolish, he started to see it as evidence that he had been right to trust Tino, and Tino had been wrong to violate that trust. The fault wasn't in Michael's capacity for loyalty, but in Tino's capacity for betrayal. And there was something powerfully liberating about relocating the shame from where he had been carrying it to where it actually belonged. This didn't make the pain go away, it didn't erase the grief of losing someone who had been woven into the fabric of his life story, but it did allow him to start separating his own worth from Tino's choices, to understand that being betrayed said something about Tino's character rather than Michael's judgment. The real test came in how Michael chose to handle the situation publicly, because he had the power to destroy Tino in ways that went far beyond financial restitution. One press conference would have been enough to turn Tino into a pariah, to ensure that he would never be able to work in any legitimate business again, to make his name synonymous with betrayal and theft in the way that certain names become shorthand for specific types of moral failure. Michael's lawyers had actually recommended this approach, arguing that making an example of Tino would discourage other people from trying to take advantage of him, would send a clear message that betraying Michael Jordan came with consequences that extended far beyond the courtroom. And there was a part of Michael that wanted this, that wanted to exercise the full extent of his power to punish the person who had hurt him so deeply, that craved the satisfaction of watching Tino face public humiliation as payment for private treachery. But as Michael sat with this decision, as he imagined what it would feel like to deploy his fame as a weapon of destruction, he realized that doing so would fundamentally change who he was in ways he couldn't accept. The person he wanted to be, the person he had always tried to be despite the competitive ruthlessness he showed on the court, was someone who handled his business with dignity and kept private matters private, even when going public would have been justified. Destroying Tino publicly would feel satisfying in the moment, but would ultimately diminish Michael himself, would make him someone who used his power to crush people rather than someone who used his power to build things and create opportunities. It would also mean that for the rest of his life, when people talked about Tino Whitmore, they would have to talk about Michael Jordan, forever linking their names together in a way that would give Tino's betrayal a permanent place in Michael's public narrative. So Michael made a choice that stunned everyone who knew the details of what had happened. He handled the entire situation quietly, through lawyers, recovered what money could be recovered through civil proceedings that were kept out of the press, and never spoke Tino's name publicly again. When reporters asked about changes in his business management team, Michael gave vague answers about restructuring and bringing in new expertise without ever hinting at the betrayal that had prompted these changes. He protected Tino's reputation not because Tino deserved protection, but because Michael deserved to move forward without carrying the weight of revenge, without becoming the kind of person who got satisfaction from watching others suffer even when that suffering might be justified. This decision cost him something because there were people who suspected what had happened but couldn't prove it. People who whispered that maybe Michael had been negligent or incompetent in managing his affairs, rather than understanding that he had been actively betrayed by someone he trusted. But Michael accepted these whispers as the price of maintaining his own integrity, of being the person he wanted to see when he looked in the mirror, rather than the person his anger wanted him to become. And something unexpected happened as a result of this choice. The other people in his life, the ones who did know what had happened because they worked closely enough with him to have seen the evidence, watched how he handled this situation, and it fundamentally changed how they saw him. They had always known Michael as the most competitive person they had ever met, someone whose drive to win sometimes made him harsh and demanding in ways that could be difficult to be around. But now they saw a different kind of strength that had nothing to do with basket. They saw someone who could be profoundly hurt and still choose grace over vengeance, who could be betrayed and still refuse to become bitter, who could have every justification for destroying someone and still choose the harder path of simply walking away. This revelation of character had a ripple effect through the Bulls organization that nobody could have predicted. Scottie Pippen, who had sometimes chafed under Michael's demanding leadership style, found himself developing a deeper respect for Michael that went beyond his basketball abilities. During a long road trip late in that season, Scottie had asked Michael about how he was doing after everything that had happened, and Michael had been honest in a way that he rarely was with teammates, admitting that he was still struggling to trust people, but that he was trying not to let one person's betrayal poison his relationships with everyone else. That conversation had opened up something between them that transcended the typical relationship between team's alpha dog and his second-in-command, had created space for Scottie to share his own frustrations and insecurities in ways he had never felt comfortable doing before. The trust that developed from that vulnerability became the foundation for the Bulls' championship run that year, their third in a row, because now they were playing not just as teammates who shared a common goal, but as people who genuinely understood and valued each other beyond what they could accomplish on the court. Michael still demanded excellence from everyone around him, still held people to standards that could feel unreasonable. But there was a different quality to his leadership now, a recognition that the people he played with were human beings with their own struggles and not just tools to be deployed in pursuit of victory. And paradoxically, by caring more about his teammates as people, Michael got better performances from them as players, because they were no longer playing just to avoid his wrath or to prove themselves worthy of being on his team, but because they wanted to give their best effort for someone who had shown them what real character looked like in a moment of crisis. The championship they won that June felt different to Michael than the previous two. Not because the basketball was any more impressive or the competition any more challenging, but because he had fought for it while carrying a wound that he had refused to let define him. Every game had been an act of faith, a decision to trust his teammates in crucial moments, even when a voice in his head whispered that trust was dangerous. And every time he made that choice, he was proving to himself that Tino hadn't taken everything, hadn't destroyed his capacity for connection, even though he had certainly tried. When they clinched the title against Phoenix and Michael collapsed on the floor clutching the basketball, the tears that came were about more than just winning a championship. They were about surviving something that could have broken him and coming out the other side still recognizably himself, still capable of trusting and hoping and believing in people even after being given every reason not. The weeks after that championship brought a different kind of challenge, as Michael had to navigate public appearances and celebrations while carrying private grief that he couldn't share. Everyone around him saw only the three-peat that put him in rarefied air with the great dynasties of basketball history, the iconic image of him cradling that ball on the floor with his head down, but nobody except the people closest to him understood that this victory had been won by someone who was simultaneously at the peak of his professional powers and in the depths of personal pain. The press conferences and parade and meetings with the president all required Michael to perform happiness that he didn't entirely feel, to embody the champion who had conquered all obstacles when he still felt like someone trying to figure out how to trust again after being taught a brutal lesson about human nature. But then something happened during that summer that began to shift something fundamental in how Michael processed what had occurred. He received a letter, not from Tino seeking forgiveness, but from a young man named Raymond Pierce, who lived in Wilmington and had heard through community connections about some of what had happened even though Michael had kept it quiet. Raymond wrote that he had grown up idolizing Michael not just for his basketball achievements, but for how he carried himself, for his loyalty to the people he came from, for the way he had brought friends and family along as he rose rather than leaving them behind. He wrote about how he had recently started a small business and had taken on a partner who was his best friend, and about how everyone had warned him that friendship and business didn't mix, that he was being naive to trust someone just because they had history together. But Raymond wrote that Michael's example had given him faith that loyalty mattered, that there was value in bringing the people you cared about into your success, rather than treating every relationship as a potential threat, and that even though he didn't know all the details of what had happened in Michael's situation, the fact that Michael hadn't publicly destroyed whoever had betrayed him made Raymond believe that dignity and grace mattered more than revenge. The letter was remarkable, not for any particular eloquence. Raymond wasn't a writer, and the grammar wasn't perfect, but for the window it provided into how Michael's choices were being observed and interpreted by people who would never meet him but who looked to him as a model for how to navigate the world. And reading this letter made Michael realize that how he handled this betrayal wasn't just about his own healing or his own reputation, but about what message he sent to everyone who watched how he moved through the world. This realization didn't erase the pain of what Tino had done, didn't make the betrayal hurt any less, or the grief any less profound. But it did give it meaning beyond just personal suffering. If his choice to handle this quietly and with dignity inspired even one person to believe that trust was still worthwhile despite its risks, then maybe something good could come from something terrible. If his refusal to become bitter and vengeful showed someone else that you could be hurt deeply and still choose grace, then maybe the wound Tino had inflicted could become a scar that told a story about resilience rather than an open trauma that defined everything that came after. Michael wrote back to Raymond a longer letter than he usually wrote to strangers, encouraging him to trust his instincts about his friend, while also being smart about protecting himself, acknowledging that sometimes people will betray you, but that the risk of betrayal is the price we pay for the possibility of genuine connection. As the years passed and Michael's career continued, the Tino situation became something he thought about less and less frequently, not because he had forgotten, but because he had integrated it into his understanding of himself in a way that made it just one chapter in a longer story, rather than the defining trauma that colored everything else. He won 3 more championships after the betrayal, building a second three-peat that cemented his status as the greatest player to ever touch a basketball, and each of those victories was made sweeter by the knowledge that he had won them after learning one of life's hardest lessons about trust and betrayal and human nature. The teammates he won those later championships with benefited from the wisdom he had gained through suffering, from his hard-earned understanding that trust had to be given even though it could be violated, that connection required vulnerability even though vulnerability could be exploited. Michael never spoke to Tino again after that morning in the office where the lies had finally collapsed. Never reached out even when mutual friends suggested that maybe enough time had passed for reconciliation. Never responded to the single letter Tino sent years later that offered an apology that came far too late to matter. Not because he couldn't forgive. He had done that work for his own sake rather than Tino's, but because forgiveness didn't require reconciliation and there was simply nothing left of their friendship to salvage. The Tino he had loved had never really existed except in Michael's imagination, and the Tino who actually existed was someone Michael had no interest in knowing. This wasn't cruelty but boundaries, not revenge but simple recognition that some things once broken cannot be repaired, and that trying to rebuild on a foundation of betrayal would just mean creating more opportunities to be hurt. The business empire Michael built after the betrayal was structured differently than it would have been if he had never learned this lesson, with more checks and balances, more transparency, more professional distance between personal relationships and financial decisions, but also with more opportunities for people to rise based on merit rather than connection. The people who worked for Michael in those later years often remarked on a quality of fairness in how he operated, a willingness to give people chances, but also a clear-eyed assessment of performance that didn't confuse friendship with competence. He had learned to separate trust as an emotional experience from trust as a business practice, to understand that you could care about someone deeply while still insisting on systems that made betrayal difficult. This wasn't cynicism but wisdom, not closing himself off, but protecting himself smartly while remaining open to genuine connection. And then decades later, long after Michael had retired from basketball and become a successful team owner, long after the betrayal had receded into history as just one of many challenges he had overcome, he received news that Tino Whitmore had died of a heart attack at the age of 63. The phone call came from someone in Wellington who thought Michael should know, even though everyone understood that there was no relationship left between them. And for a moment Michael was transported back to that office where he had watched someone he loved transform into a stranger. But what he felt in that moment wasn't the pain of the betrayal or the anger of having been used. It was something more complicated and ultimately more human. A sadness for what might have been if Tino had been capable of honoring rather than exploiting the trust Michael had placed in him. Michael didn't attend the funeral. That would have been inappropriate given everything that had happened. But he did send flowers with a card that said simply, "For who you were before you became who you chose to be." And that was the final word on a friendship that had shaped him in ways both beautiful and terrible. The grief he felt at Tino's death wasn't for the person Tino had been at the end, who had stolen and lied and betrayed, but for the 15-year-old boy who had rebounded for him on those early mornings when they both believed that loyalty and friendship meant something unbreakable. That boy had existed, those memories were real, and the fact that Tino had eventually betrayed everything they had built together didn't erase the genuine connection they had shared before greed and resentment had poisoned. Looking back on his life from the perspective of old age, Michael understood that the betrayal by Tino Whitmore had been one of the most important things that ever happened to him, not because it was pleasant or wanted or in any way positive in itself, but because how he chose respond to it had revealed his character in ways that success never could. Anyone can be generous when they're winning, can be kind when life is going their way, can trust people when there's no reason to doubt them. The real test of who you are comes when you've been hurt. When someone has given you every justification to become bitter and vengeful, when the world would understand if you used your power to destroy the person who betrayed you, and you still choose grace. That choice, made in one of the darkest moments of his life, had proved something about Michael Jordan that mattered more than any championship, more than any scoring title, more than any record that would eventually be broken by someone younger and more talented. It proved that he was not just the greatest basketball player who ever lived, but someone whose greatness extended beyond what he could do with a ball in his hands, someone who could be devastated and still refuse to become destructive, who could be betrayed and still believe in loyalty, who could have every reason to give up on humanity and still choose to have faith in people. And in the end, the choice to remain capable of trust after being given every reason not to trust anyone was what truly made him the greatest of all time, because it showed that his competitive fire and demanding nature and relentless drive for excellence were built on a foundation of genuine character rather than just ego and ambition. Tino Whitmore had tried to take everything from Michael Jordan, had stolen his money and violated his trust and poisoned one of the most important relationships of his life. But what Tino could never take was Michael's choice about who he would become in response to that betrayal, and the man Michael chose to be in that moment of crisis was worth more than all the gold medals and championship rings in the world. So where are you listening from right now? Drop your city or country in the comments below. If this story touched your heart or taught you something about handling betrayal with grace, hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Let's spread more stories about kindness and character to everyone who needs to hear them. And hey, don't go anywhere yet. Click on that video appearing on your screen right now for another incredible story you won't want to miss.